don't let yourself get fat because you're just adding new fat cells. You're making your prep much more difficult. There's no mechanism in the human body where excess amounts of food just magically becomes muscle tissue.
I think also, we always think about pulling off fat, but the bodybuilding is also about retaining tissue. And so like carrying your same type of training habits into prep, as long as those habits were of high quality, like you need to train hard in prep. And the guys that I see usually that were never that trained that hard to begin with are also the ones I see that usually don't get into great contest shape because that stimulus to hold on to tissue is just not that great. And when you're in a calorie deficit, that same training response doesn't produce the same type of anabolic response. So now you just see someone that's just getting a smaller version of themselves. Mm-hmm. So upholding hard training, but in doing so, then you need the fatigue management part of the equation there. And as you get closer to show with the right timeline, we can start adding in more refeeds, creating a smaller deficit, slowing down fat loss when you have less body fat to lose. And that slowly just kind of brings someone down into that next level of condition where you can see them start landing the plane before peak week. And you're now living at like a maintenance calorie level and you start removing some extra fatigue and start getting even harder because most of that wasn't water weight from all your tests you're running. It's probably water weight from high cortisol and inflammation. And here we are. Peak week has arrived.
Yeah. So where do you think is the ideal ending point of an off season regarding how many weeks you're out from a competition? Is that 8 weeks out from a competition, 12 weeks, 16 weeks? Like what would be the maximum amount of body fat that you should be able to gain in the off season to make sure that you stay within striking distance of a productive contest prep?
Yeah, and like Dean, you're talking about like a body fat set point, and you do need to get someone back to a productive spot where their body fat level allows them to not have like sleep issues or food focus and optimize training. And that's just very different for everyone, right? Like we see that asshole we hate that is just ripped and has glute lines all year long and never gets that fat. Well, someone else like a female that has to get to like 24% body fat to be back to like a hormonal normal state. And so they need some room to progress. And for that realistic for someone, that might having them get more than 24 weeks out of dieting. Like if you look at the natural sector, all those guys diet for a lot longer period of time. But that might require like I've had some individuals where we need like a mini fat loss phase before we actually even enter prep. But I would say as a general rule of thumb, I try to not let anyone get past 24 weeks of dieting. If it's less, that's even better. But ideally, like, hey, this 16 to 20 week mark is kind of a good sweet spot, which a lot of people have done 16 to 20 week preps. That's pretty reasonable. But I would say, like, for yourself, if you're out there and you're listening, if you were better for your second show, likely you should tack on those weeks of you probably weren't a 16 week prep. You're really a 20 or 24 week prep. We see that a lot, especially with females doing multiple shows. Like finally they get better in condition. It's like, oh, well, look at that. That's actually a 28 week prep. But you say 28 week prep to someone, they're like, oh my gosh, like, no, I'm going with this other coach that's going to do a 16 week prep.
And then a DMP is included.
So it varies so much, right? Like last year when I jumped in Toronto early, like I got ready quick. Actually, it was only 8 weeks till I did that show. But I stayed lean. So just, it varies. But manage the timeline and just make sure when you're in your off season that I would say, hey, at least be able to have like 16 to 20 weeks of like productive time to add on body weight and not need to mini cut. So if you're in that state where you're needing to cut sooner, like probably just adding too much body fat on in that post show phase to begin with.
All right. Kurt.
I mean, just to add to what they said, I think one of the reasons why John is so successful is because he stays much leaner all year round now. And that's a big thing, right? Is get to that body fat point that you can hold comfortably where you can still make progress, but don't let yourself get fat because you're just, Dean said previously, you're adding new fat cells. You're making your prep much more difficult. It's not advantageous to carry extra body fat. It's not going to make you a better bodybuilder just because the scale went up. There's no mechanism in the human body where excess amounts of food just magically becomes muscle tissue. That's not the stimulus for muscle growth. It's and to define some things like refeed. I think people misunderstand what a refeed is. A refeed is not a burger and fries. A refeed is where we leverage carbohydrates appropriately, right? That's really the macro that has the most effect on your appearance and your performance. Not so much the dietary fat, especially when it comes to deep fried stuff. Like, I really try to keep my guys away from stuff like French fries and stuff like that. It just does nothing positive for you. Outside of some mental benefits, maybe, of having a cheat meal, that's not really a tool that we use, right? And that's why I typically have most guys are carb cycling. So we're kind of going through that process the whole time. And we can constantly move the food up and down. And like Dean saw, as you get deeper into prep, for most guys, when they're getting really close to being ready, their metabolism starts to run away, right? Their body fat will just continually drop really quickly at the end. And I've had guys where I have to refeed 2 days in a row, 3 days in a row. Some of the pros like John that have a ton of muscle mass that stay pretty lean, their metabolism is wild at the end. You get guys, eating a ton of food going into a show. But a lot of that success is set up in the off season. And not to steal a term from AJ, but I prefer the term progress season versus off season, because you're never really off, right? That same training and mentality and dieting and all that stuff is year round. It's just the quantity of things is different, right? There's probably less cardio, obviously less dieting, but the food is roughly the same, right? John, you probably eat the same stuff year round, just the different quantity. You're not all of a sudden going from pizza to chicken and rice, right? It's the same measured stuff day in and day out. I've ate the same breakfast for 30 something years. It just, the amount of it just differs depending on what your goal is. Yeah. And it's interesting because you don't see the same level of conditioning nowadays, probably because the bodybuilding community has grown, right? So there's some is a genetic component, right? Not everyone can get that lean to be a competitive bodybuilder. And as the population in bodybuilding gets larger and larger, it attracts more, let's say, average people that, might not be able to have that look. Like, not every human can look like John Jewett. I hate to say that, but he was born different than most people, right? Just like any other athlete in any professional sport, there is a huge genetic component to it. And a lot of it's mental. Like, your brain can handle things that most guys would break, halfway through. You see that often, right? And going back to the point of a diet, like you both said, just to read it, the point of a diet is to maintain intensity in training, to maintain muscle mass, and then to lose fat. If you've lost the first two and you're just losing fat, you're probably losing muscle with it as well, right? If your fatigue level is so high that you're not sleeping, like you're just burned out from too many drugs and stuff, your progress can come to a halt.
Yeah,
like a lot of times you can get leaner by using less drugs and sleeping at night than you would using a gram of Tren and being wide awake. You're probably not going to look any better doing that.
No. If anything, you're going to look soft and watery. You've seen it happen quite a bit.
Super stressed out.
Like, what I notice when people make the most progress is when they eat exactly the same food during the off season, aka progress season and contest prep. It just, the amounts are different. So you might have a little bit more protein, less carbohydrates during a cutting phase. Whereas in the off season, progress season, it's reversed, because the more carbohydrates you eat, you have a little bit of a protein sparing effect. So you can eat less protein and more carbohydrates, maybe a little bit more fat, if your metabolism is really ramped up. And then refeeds are pretty much the same as what you eat during the week, just more of that as well. And then, of course, once in a while, there might be a cheat meal incorporated, but there's a difference between going out for sushi and going out for pizzas, like a 4 or 5 cheese pizza, right? The composition of the meals are quite different, and everybody gets strung up like, I need a cheat meal to refeed and fill out, and I'm going to go with a pizza and Ben & Jerry's, but that's probably the wrong approach. So I would send most of my guys just for sushi, because that seems to be pretty similar to what you had during your week anyway. It's rice and fish. Okay, the rice has a little bit of sugar in it, some vinegar, but it's way better for you as a cheat meal than what most people go with. So I think that the food selection throughout the entire year really contributes to how you end up looking like. And then I think what the hardest part is for myself and many people out there is that when they go on holiday, that the diet kind of falls apart because you're not close to your kitchen. There's not foods that you usually have. Like I just give up on a holiday. I've tried it for 10 years, and when I go on holiday, I just eat whatever. But then, that sets me back. weeks to months sometimes. That's why most guys just don't travel unless it's for business.
Yeah, it's funny because we came back from the auto. Renee and I were like, we're never leaving till I prep again. Like, it's like that was it. Like, it's so challenged out there. Like, pulled 3 pounds down. Like, man, if I wasn't adding more and more food in, it was going to be a problem. But the variability makes a challenge for someone in the off season. Which, yeah, like you, Steve. Like, we went to Banff for vacation in the off season, which is like non-bodybuilding trip, right? Just true vacation. But still, like, we do like a dinner a night, but take all my food, and I'm watching the scale every day to try to account for different activity levels. But if you're traveling a lot as a bodybuilder, man, it makes it really hard to string together progress.
Yeah, especially as you get bigger, because your body's so more dependent on the food intake, and people don't understand how much food you need to eat just to sustain your weight and keep that activity level going. And then if you go away from home, even one flight, you're missing meals. And your physique kind of falls apart. So that's why you see most IFBB pros, they barely travel when they're successful. Like I don't see Derek go on holiday. I don't see Samson go on holiday. I don't see Nick Walker go on holiday. Most of the successful guys at the pro level, it's minimal holidays. And normal people, myself included, I'd like to go out sometimes. And that's where the bodybuilding takes a setback and makes, peaking into a contest very, very difficult, because you have just days where you just fuck off, basically, and it doesn't contribute to the bigger picture.
Yeah, I've gotten such like great speaking opportunities to go like international, and I just have to turn them down. It's like at this time, like, man, I have to prioritize bodybuilding. But